When I thought of who to write about for this project, I immediately thought of the man, Winston Churchill. He is hailed by many as one of the greatest leaders of the 20th century, and by some as one of the greatest leaders to ever have existed. And as I studied and reflected on his life, his upbringing, his speeches, I thought, what is the difference between success and failure? What qualifies a victory or a defeat? What's the distance between these two things? Many times we view them as being polar opposites. Success is on one end of the spectrum and failure is on the other end, never to meet. But as I thought about this and did some research, I learned that in the 2016 Olympics, the woman gold medalist, Shanae Miller, beat her opponent, Allison Felix, in the 400-meter run by just 7 milliseconds. 7 milliseconds is such a minuscule amount of time. We do not even notice that it passes so many times in a single day. Yet on that day in the 2016 Olympics, that was the only difference between victory and relative failure. And I began to think about Winston Churchill's life, about the speeches he gave, about the life he led, and how those decisions made all the difference in the world. When he gave his very first speech in the Commons as Prime Minister of Great Britain, he faced a lot of pressure on both sides of the political aisle. Some people wanted him to just make peace with Hitler's forces. They just wanted him to cause as little waves as possible and to just try to stop this enemy in a peaceful way without going to war. While the other side of the political sphere wanted him to stand up against this foe that was demonizing the world. And Churchill's decision for the nation to wage war against Nazi Germany, that single decision, is what led to the World War II, and it's what led to ultimate victory for Great Britain and the free world as we know it. So I thought that one choice, one speech, one intervention of God or man could make all the difference. That could be the only distance. That one choice, that one speech, that one man could be all the difference between victory and failure. Winston Churchill was born Sir Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill on November the 30th, 1874. And he was born to John Churchill and Jenny Jerome in England. His father was a politician, and he possessed an impressive military background, and his mother was known and admired for her beauty. And unfortunately, his parents were not dutiful caretakers. Instead, God allowed into his life a nanny by the name of Mrs. Everest. And God used her in Churchill's life to shape him into the man that he would become. In fact, in his autobiography entitled My Early Life, Winston Churchill said this: "I loved my mother dearly, but at a distance. My nurse was my confidant. Mrs. Everest it was who looked after me and tended all my wants." Her death, when Winston Churchill was just 21 years old, significantly impacted his life. He paid for her headstone and its upkeep, and his family to this day still pays for the upkeep of Miss Everest's grave. Churchill did not thrive academically, and when he was just a teenager, his father decided to put him in the Royal Military College to pursue a military career. And this single decision by Churchill's father to put him on this path proved to be instrumental in preparing him for his future role as Prime Minister. And during his military career, he accomplished many things. He was a wonderful writer, and he served and wrote about the conflicts in Cuba and India as a soldier and as a journalist. And among many of his military exploits, one of his most well-known exploit was that he rescued an ambushed train during the war, but then was taken prisoner because of that exploit. But he did not stay in prison for very long because he miraculously escaped from prison. So needless to say, when he came back to Great Britain, he was hailed as a military hero. And because of these things that he did to prove himself in the military realm, and because of his orator skills, he began to get into politics. He was able to defend and explain policies, and so he became the president of the Board of Trade. He also joined the liberal side of politics and really advocated for reform policies. Some people saw him as a traitor to his policy, and other people admired him for taking a stand for what he believed in. So throughout his political and military career, Churchill served in many different positions, but all of them providentially prepared him for the greatest task he would face. In the face of the German invasion, it became very clear that Churchill was the only man, the man for the hour, to lead the nation during the time. He was a devoted patriot, he loved his country, he believed in freedom, and he was a defender of his nation's reputation of exceptionalism. And he fervently believed that it was Great Britain's divine assignment to stand up to the tyrannies of Hitler and Nazi Germany. In fact, his grandson, Randolph Churchill, said that he was not half in, he was committed to victory no matter the cost, and he said that Winston Churchill's words inspired a nation. In fact, in one of his most famous speeches when rallying the Englishmen to keep up the good fight against Hitler, he said, "If we can stand up to Hitler, all Europe may be free, and the life of the world may move forward into broad sunlit uplands. But if we fail, then the whole world will sink into the abyss of a new dark age. Let us therefore embrace ourselves to our duty, and so bear ourselves that if the British Commonwealth and Empire last for 1,000 years, men will still say this was their finest hour." And we were asked in this project to take 5 leadership approaches and compare them to the person we chose to study, and to see if they would qualify as a leader when considering that approach to leadership. I would first like to consider the trait approach to leadership. Churchill would definitely be considered a leader here, because while some would say he had some natural traits that would disqualify him from this, largely he would be considered a leader because he was passionate, he was considered larger than life, dynamic, and most above all, he was able to motivate others with his speeches. One speech excerpt that shows his ability to inspire others, his trait, his ability to do that, was when he said, "You ask, what is our aim? I can answer in one word. It is victory. Victory at all cost. Victory in spite of all terror. Victory however long and hard the road may be, for without victory there is no survival." Next, I would like to consider the skills approach to leadership. And this approach classifies leaders as the ones that possess the skills that they need to lead. And Churchill was an honored writer. He won awards for much of his written work. He was a trained military man and a skilled orator. His speeches moved a nation. And for these skills, both natural and learned, he would definitely be considered a leader in this approach. Now, if some said, well, he was just born with the natural ability to write or the natural ability to speak, so it doesn't necessarily classify him as being a leader in this skills approach, where a person purposefully hones a skill for a specific task. I would say, even if that was true for his orator skills and his writing abilities, he would still be considered a leader in this approach because of his leadership abilities in military combat. He, like mentioned before, he rescued an ambushed train. He developed his leadership skills. He was hailed as a military hero by the leaders in his nation. And relating to the topic of developing one's personal skills and abilities, Churchill is noted as saying, "To improve is to change. So to be perfect is to change often." So this quote alludes to the fact that Churchill thought a lot of using all of the resources he could to improve his skills and natural abilities. Historians say that he was actually a voracious reader. He did not want to stop growing and learning. Next, I would like to consider the behavioral approach to leadership, which is a mixed bag for Churchill. Many historians said that he was noted to be short with people, that he lacked in personal skills and empathy, and he was seemingly undisciplined in some areas of his life. However, many authors noted that even though Churchill stayed in his bed until 11 a.m. each morning, he may have accomplished more in his day through letter dictation, reading, strategizing, than most other men would have done working in their offices since 7 a.m. It seems that his greatest downfall in this categorization of leadership was in his handling of interpersonal relationships. Some considered him, quote, stubborn to a fault, hubristic, and short with others, end quote. Yet, like many people that we find in the Bible, leaders in the world, God can use even someone with some behavioral problems to become a wonderful leader. Next, I would like to consider the situational approach to leadership. So this approach says that a good leader will adapt his leadership style and skills to best suit the situation in which he or she finds themselves. I think that this is 100% true of Churchill, but not because of any effort on his own part. In a book written by Sandys and Henley called God in Churchill, it is noted that as a 16-year-old boy, Churchill had an unexplainable vision. And this is what he said in his vision. This country will be subjected somehow to a tremendous invasion. I shall be in command of the defenses of London. It will fall to me to save the capital, to save the empire. In fact, this entire book, God in Churchill, is devoted to trying to explain how God providentially prepared Churchill for a situation he would face many years later. He was able to react in the right way in this situation because of the unseen hand of God. Lastly, I would like to consider the path-goal leadership theory. And I believe that Churchill would be considered a leader here as well. And the major concept of this theory is that good leaders will set their followers on the right path to achieve the desired goal. So instead of leaving their followers, their employees, up to deciding what the goal is or even what path to get on to achieve that goal, it says that a good leader will clearly define success for their employees and how they can achieve that success. And I believe that appropriately describes what Churchill did in his motivational speeches during World War II. He reminded the people who they were and how they would not stop until they saw the evil forces defeated and good and right upheld. In one of his famous speeches in the Commons, Churchill reminds the people that they will fight on the beaches and fight on the landing grounds and fight in the fields and the streets and anywhere else that was necessary to see the victory won. So the goal here was freedom for Great Britain and the world, and the path to achieve that goal was unavoidable war. I would like to consider next God and Churchill in a way that we can see some biblical comparisons in Churchill's life. Just like Esther was raised up in the Persian Empire for what the Bible calls for such a time as this, we see that God raised up Churchill for just the right moment in the British Empire with the right abilities, with the right unconscious preparation to lead the free world to victory in the face of a horrible enemy. In Proverbs 21:1, the Bible says, the king's heart is in the hand of the Lord. As the rivers of water, he turneth it whithersoever he will. And in Proverbs 16:9, the Bible states, a man's heart deviseth his way, but the Lord directeth his steps. And I thought that must have been what Benjamin Franklin meant when he said, God governs in the affairs of men. From the very creation of the world, from when he put Adam and Eve in a perfect garden and prepared that place for them, and then when they fell and sin entered the world and God provided a way of salvation for mankind, we see that God has an abiding interest in mankind and what happens in the affairs of men. And we see how God has helped man and guided man through both conscious and unconscious preparation. And God used something in Churchill's neglected childhood to shape him to be the leader that he became. He used the influence of his nanny, Mrs. Everest. He used his military training, his desires to write. All of those things, he used all of those things in his life to shape him to become the man that he should be. And in the life of every Bible character, we can also point to situations or things that happened in their lives that helped them face situations they would face in the future. When we think of the life of Joseph, we think if Joseph had not been sold into Egyptian slavery by his brothers, he never would have saved the lives of God's chosen people or his family from the famine that was coming. And if he had not been working in Potiphar's house, who was a high up Egyptian official, then he would have not been cast into the same prison that the servants of Pharaoh were placed in. And God used situations, both the good ones and the bad ones, to accomplish something in Joseph's life, to save Joseph, his family, and his nation. And in the same way, we see that God used Winston Churchill to stop the tyrannies of Hitler from taking over the world. And I believe with the authors of God and Churchill that Churchill's life was uniquely used and guided by God for a special purpose. And as I reflect on the life of Churchill, I'm reminded of a plaque my father-in-law had in his church office several years ago. And the plaque said, "Some people are born great, some people achieve greatness, and some people have greatness thrust upon them." And this quote sums up the leadership we find in the world today. Some people are born to be leaders, like the Queen of England. Maybe they didn't do anything to deserve it, but they were born into that family. And because they were born into that family, they are a leader. Some people work hard and use their natural abilities and hone skills to create a place of leadership for themselves in this world, and that is always admired. And Churchill falls most closely in the last of these three categories. Because Churchill never asked to be the Prime Minister during Great Britain's darkest hour. He never asked Neville Chamberlain to resign his old post to him. He never asked that they hail him as a military leader or for his father to put him in military school. Instead, in a situation that secularists describe as fate, we see that God thrust Churchill into one of the greatest roles of leadership in the 20th century. There really is not much distance between failure and victory. I thought, as I finished my research for this paper, what would have happened if Winston Churchill had never existed? Or if he just simply failed to assume the responsibility he was given? What would Great Britain look like today? What would America look like today? What would the rest of the free world look like today? And there's been many Hollywood movies or shows that have tried to depict what it would look like had Hitler won or had the Axis powers won World War II. But none of them could perfectly depict what could have happened if that had been the case. And the violent acts against the Jewish people and their defenders are meticulously recorded by historians. And it's often described today as the greatest human atrocity in the modern world. And what that atrocity needed was a strong, indomitable leader. And what we do know is that the direction of all of our lives would be very different had this leader never been born. So we know that the space between the great loss of the world as we know it and the victory of freedom, the persistence of peace, was just one man and God's undeniable hand in his life.